Chief Dominic Shaw, the recently appointed head of the police force, was brought in specifically to overhaul a department with a well-documented history of discriminatory traffic stops. He was in his third day on the job, piloting a Lamborghini Urus through the very neighborhoods where complaints were most prevalent, observing which officers would pull him over based solely on the hue of his complexion and the automobile he was driving. Officer Eric Holloway, a seasoned officer with 7 years of service and 2 prior complaints concerning racially motivated stops that had been previously dismissed, observed the Lamborghini being driven by a black man. He immediately initiated a traffic stop and demanded the driver's identification, registration, and proof of ownership. In his mind, it was inconceivable that a black man could legitimately possess the financial means for a $250,000 luxury sport utility vehicle. When Shaw inquired as to the reason for the stop, Holloway disregarded him and instructed him to exit the vehicle, and when Shaw declined, stating his constitutional rights were being infringed upon, Holloway commanded that if he did not disembark immediately, he would be apprehended. And when Shaw posed the question, "Arrested for what reason?" Holloway snapped back, "I am the authority figure here posing the questions, so either exit the vehicle or face arrest. The choice is yours." Officer Eric Holloway was unaware, and what he was about to discover in the most calamitous fashion was that the black man he had just subjected to profiling and an unlawful search was, in fact, the new police chief. That the stop had been a deliberate evaluation of the officer's adherence to constitutional principles, and that his transgression had been duly recorded, documented, and would result in his immediate dismissal. Before we proceed, from which city or nation are you observing this content? Please share it in the comments section. We are eager to know where you are tuning in from. Furthermore, if you believe that operating an expensive vehicle while black should not constitute a criminal offense or be perceived as suspicious behavior, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. The municipality of Parkdale had been grappling with this persistent issue for years, and it was common knowledge. The police department had been subjected to 3 separate federal investigations by the Department of Justice, all of which centered on the identical concern, a documented pattern of racial profiling that had led to hundreds of grievances from black and Latino residents who asserted they had been stopped, questioned, and searched without any legal basis. These complaints had been formally submitted, reviewed, and in the majority of instances were dismissed with negligible repercussions for the officers involved. The community had been advocating for reform for an extended period, and the city council had ultimately responded by appointing an individual from outside the department to implement corrective measures. Chief Dominic Shaw was 45 years of age, with 22 years of experience in law enforcement, and he had cultivated a reputation as a reformer who would not tolerate officers who disregarded the Constitution. He had progressed through the ranks, starting as a patrol officer, then a detective, and eventually a captain within a neighboring city's police department. Throughout his career, he had garnered respect for his fairness, transparency, and his unwavering commitment to holding officers accountable when they overstepped their boundaries. When the mayor of Parkdale contacted him and extended an offer for the position of police chief, accompanied by a clear directive to identify and remove officers engaged in racial profiling, Shaw accepted without hesitation. He understood the challenges he would face. He had thoroughly reviewed the data pertaining to complaints. He had studied the Department of Justice reports and recognized that mere words and policies would be insufficient. He needed to personally ascertain which officers would uphold the law and which would allow their personal prejudices to supersede their professional training. Shaw had been on the job for 3 days, and he had dedicated those 3 days to an activity that most police chiefs would never undertake. He had been driving his personal vehicle, a pearl white Lamborghini Urus that he had acquired 2 years prior using funds he had diligently saved over 2 decades from his overtime earnings in security positions. He navigated through the districts with the highest incidence of racial profiling complaints. He was dressed in smart casual attire, adhered strictly to the posted speed limits, obeyed every traffic regulation, and patiently awaited the opportune moment to observe which officers would initiate a stop based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the vehicle he was operating. On the first day, he had been stopped once by an officer who approached him courteously, requested his identification and registration, and when Shaw inquired about the reason for the stop, the officer admitted he had no specific infraction in mind, but felt the vehicle appeared incongruous in the neighborhood. Upon identifying himself as the new police chief, the officer offered an immediate apology and permitted him to depart. Shaw made a note of the officer's name, but did not impose any disciplinary action, as the officer had been forthright and had not violated Shaw's rights. On the second day, he was stopped again by a different officer who posed similar inquiries, but desisted as soon as Shaw explained that he was the new chief conducting a test of departmental protocols. That officer also received a notation in his personnel file, but no formal disciplinary action was taken. On the third day, Shaw was driving through District 7, one of the areas with the highest concentration of complaints, when he noticed the patrol car in his rearview mirror. Officer Eric Holloway had been assigned to District 7 for the past 4 years, and during that period he had developed a reputation that his superiors had documented but never addressed with appropriate seriousness. Holloway was 33 years old and had been on the force for 7 years. He had been the subject of 2 formal complaints from black drivers who alleged he had stopped them without justification, demanded proof of vehicle ownership, and conducted searches of their cars without their consent. The initial complaint originated from a black physician driving a BMW who had been stopped and accused of operating a stolen vehicle, despite presenting his registration and proof of insurance. The subsequent complaint came from a black business owner driving a Mercedes who was detained by Holloway for 45 minutes while repeated background checks were conducted on both the vehicle and its driver. All of this was based solely on the assumption that a black man could not afford an expensive automobile. Both complaints had undergone investigation and were dismissed with mere verbal admonishments. Holloway's record indicated a pattern, yet this pattern had been overlooked. That afternoon, Holloway was on patrol when he observed the Lamborghini Urus traversing his district. The SUV was proceeding at the exact posted speed limit, maintained its lane discipline, and observed every traffic signal. There was no erratic driving, no discernible equipment violations, nothing that would constitute a legal basis for initiating a traffic stop. However, Holloway perceived a black man at the helm of a $250,000 luxury vehicle, and his ingrained instincts, shaped by years of operating on conjecture rather than concrete evidence, signaled that something was amiss. Holloway activated his emergency lights and pulled the Lamborghini over. Shaw observed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror and experienced a familiar confluence of vexation and resolve. This was precisely the scenario he had been anticipating. He guided his vehicle to the shoulder, engaged the parking brake, and awaited the officer's approach with his hands clearly visible on the steering wheel. Holloway disembarked from his patrol car and approached the driver's side window, his hand resting on his service sidearm, a posture designed to convey authority and a potential threat. He halted at the window and gazed at Shaw, and his initial utterance was not a greeting or an explanation. It was a demand: license, registration, and proof of ownership now. Shaw looked up at Holloway, his demeanor composed, but his voice carried a deliberate precision. "Officer, could you please inform me of the reason for this stop?" Holloway did not address the question directly. He reiterated his demand, his tone becoming more insistent. "License, registration, and proof of ownership. Let me see them." Shaw deliberately reached into the center console and retrieved his wallet, his vehicle's registration, and his insurance card. He passed them through the window to Holloway, who took them and examined them meticulously. The driver's license displayed the name Dominic Shaw, but Holloway failed to recognize it. He had been informed during roll call 3 days prior that a new police chief had been appointed, but he had not paid close attention to the name, and certainly no photograph had been provided. Holloway perused the registration, which indicated that the Lamborghini was registered to Dominic Shaw at an address in a neighboring municipality. He then looked back at Shaw. "Is this your vehicle?" Shaw's voice remained calm. "Yes. As you can ascertain from the registration, it is registered in my name." Holloway's tone shifted to one of suspicion. "How do you finance a vehicle of this caliber?" Shaw's gaze narrowed slightly. "That is not a legally permissible question, officer. Did you observe a specific infraction that warranted this stop?" Holloway disliked the pushback. In his experience, individuals who challenged him were those with something to conceal. "You are operating a high-value vehicle through this neighborhood. That is sufficient justification for me to investigate." Shaw's voice remained steady, but an edge had now entered it. "Driving through a neighborhood is not an unlawful act, and possessing an expensive vehicle does not constitute probable cause for a traffic stop. Therefore, I will repeat my question. What specific traffic violation did I commit?" Holloway's jaw tightened. He was unaccustomed to individuals questioning his authority, and he found it highly objectionable. "Exit the vehicle." Shaw did not move. "I will not exit unless you can provide a lawful justification for this stop. You have initiated a stop without cause and are now demanding that I exit my vehicle. This constitutes a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights." Holloway's voice escalated in volume, becoming more aggressive. "If you do not exit this vehicle immediately, you will be placed under arrest." Shaw met his gaze directly. "Arrested for what?" Holloway leaned closer to the window, his voice devoid of warmth and imbued with certainty. "I am the one in command here, posing the questions. Therefore, you will either exit the vehicle or face arrest. The decision is yours." Shaw held Holloway's gaze for a protracted moment, and then he made his determination. He could continue to refuse and compel Holloway to either retreat or resort to physical force, but Shaw was intent on ascertaining the full extent of Holloway's willingness to infringe upon rights meticulously documented on camera. Shaw opened the door and stepped out of the Lamborghini, his movements deliberate and unhurried, his hands kept in plain sight at all times. As he stood at the roadside, he spoke clearly and audibly, ensuring that Holloway's body camera would capture every word. "For the record, I am exiting this vehicle under protest. I have committed no traffic violations. I have not consented to this stop, and I am unequivocally stating that I do not consent to any search of my person or my vehicle." Holloway disregarded his statement. "Place your hands on the hood." Shaw complied, placing his hands on the hood of the Lamborghini while Holloway conducted a pat-down search. Finding nothing, Holloway stepped back and surveyed the SUV. "I'm going to search your vehicle." Shaw's voice was firm. "I do not consent to a search. You lack probable cause." Holloway smirked. "I possess ample cause. An expensive vehicle exhibiting suspicious behavior. That is sufficient." Shaw shook his head. "Neither of those elements constitutes probable cause under the Fourth Amendment. I am explicitly and unequivocally stating that I do not consent to any search." Holloway proceeded to the passenger side of the Lamborghini and opened the door regardless. He inspected the glove compartment, the center console, and the area beneath the seats. He discovered nothing. He then moved to the rear of the vehicle and activated the trunk release. Within the trunk, he found a black leather briefcase, a gym bag, and nothing else. Holloway drew the briefcase towards him and opened it without hesitation, disregarding the fact that searching a sealed container without consent or a warrant represented yet another constitutional infringement. The briefcase contained several documents bearing the official seal of the Parkdale Police Department at the top. Holloway picked up the first document and began to read. Termination Notice. Officer's name, Eric Holloway. Badge number, 4127. Reason for termination. Violation of Fourth Amendment rights, conducting unlawful stop and search, racial profiling, pattern of dismissed complaints indicating bias-based policing. Effective date, today's date. Signed, Chief Dominic Shaw. Holloway stared at the document, reading it once, then again. His hands began to tremble. He looked at the signature at the bottom, then raised his eyes to Shaw, who was standing beside the Lamborghini. His face turned ashen, and his mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He looked back down at the document, then up at Shaw once more, his eyes wide with a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. He was questioning his own reality, unwilling to accept what his eyes were conveying. "You're—" Holloway's voice emerged as a mere whisper. "You're the chief." Shaw's expression remained unchanged. His voice was calm, chilling, and definitive. "Yes, I am Chief Dominic Shaw, and you have just failed the examination." Officer Eric Holloway stood at the rear of the Lamborghini Urus, clutching his own termination letter in his trembling hands, and the stark reality of his recent actions began to descend upon him with a crushing weight that made breathing difficult. He glanced at Chief Dominic Shaw, then back at the document, then at Shaw again, his mind struggling to comprehend how this situation had unfolded. "Sir, I had no idea who you were. I was merely performing my duties. I believed—" Shaw interrupted him, his voice placid but imbued with an authority that immediately silenced Holloway. "You believed what, Officer Holloway? You believed that a black man driving an expensive car must have stolen it? You believed that traversing a neighborhood constituted probable cause for a stop? You believed that refusing consent to a search meant you could proceed with the search anyway?" Holloway attempted to formulate words that might salvage the situation, but every thought that came to mind sounded like a flimsy excuse. The vehicle appeared out of place. I was exercising caution. I've conducted stops like this before and discovered— "Discovered what?" Shaw interjected again. "Let me hazard a guess. You have stopped other black men in expensive vehicles, demanded proof of ownership, and searched their cars without their consent, and most of the time you found nothing. But you persisted because, in your estimation, a black man with financial means must be a criminal." Holloway's face flushed crimson. "That is not what I was thinking." Shaw reached into his pocket and produced his mobile phone. He had initiated an audio recording from the moment Holloway approached his window, and the entire interaction had been captured. "I have recorded evidence of you demanding my license, registration, and proof of ownership without specifying a reason for the stop. I have you threatening to arrest me when I inquired about the grounds for arrest. I have you searching my vehicle after I explicitly stated that I did not consent. All of that is documented." Holloway looked at the phone, and the last vestiges of hope that he might be able to talk his way out of this predicament evaporated. "Sir, please, I have a family. I've been on the force for 7 years. I made an error in judgment." Shaw's expression remained unyielding. "This was not an error in judgment. This was a pattern. I reviewed your personnel file prior to assuming this position. You've had 2 formal complaints filed against you within the last 4 years. Both were initiated by black men driving expensive vehicles. Both involved the identical conduct you have just exhibited towards me. Both complaints were dismissed with verbal warnings, and you continued this behavior because no one ever held you accountable." Holloway's voice grew desperate. "Those complaints were investigated. They cleared me. Being cleared does not equate to being in the right, Shaw stated. It signifies that the department was unwilling to address the issue. However, I am not that type of chief. I informed the mayor that I would rectify this department, and that is precisely what I am doing. Shaw retrieved the termination letter from Holloway's grasp and placed it back into the briefcase. He then produced his radio and contacted a supervisor. "This is Chief Shaw. I require a sergeant to respond to my location immediately. I have an officer who has just conducted an unlawful stop and search, and I am relieving him of duty." The dispatcher's voice returned, tinged with confusion. "Chief Shaw, could you please repeat that?" "You heard me correctly. Dispatch a supervisor to my location without delay." Holloway remained frozen, still processing the unfolding events. "You are terminating my employment right here on the side of the road." Shaw looked at him with an expression devoid of any sympathy. "You violated my constitutional rights. You conducted an illegal search. You threatened to arrest me for asserting my rights, and you did all of this because you observed a black man in an expensive vehicle and assumed I was a criminal." "Yes, Officer Holloway, I am terminating your employment right here." Within 5 minutes, a police cruiser arrived and stopped behind Holloway's patrol car. Sergeant Maria Torres exited the vehicle, and the instant she saw Chief Shaw standing next to the Lamborghini, her expression shifted from bewilderment to concern. "Chief Shaw, what is happening?" Shaw gestured towards Holloway. "Officer Holloway just initiated a stop without cause, demanded proof of ownership for my vehicle, threatened to arrest me when I refused to exit, and then proceeded to search my car after I explicitly stated, 'I do not consent.' His body camera has the entire interaction recorded. I need him removed from active duty immediately." Torres glanced at Holloway, and her expression clearly indicated the gravity of the situation. "Officer Holloway, is that accurate?" Holloway opened his mouth to defend himself, but nothing he could utter would improve his circumstances. "I did not know he was the chief." Torres shook her head. "That is irrelevant. Did you have probable cause for the stop?" Holloway hesitated. "He was driving an expensive car in this neighborhood. It appeared suspicious." Torres closed her eyes briefly, as if unable to believe what she was hearing. She then looked at Shaw. "Sir, I apologize. This is unacceptable." Shaw nodded. "Officer Holloway is suspended, effective immediately. I require his badge, his firearm, and his body camera to be secured as evidence. He is not to return to duty pending the outcome of a formal investigation." Torres turned to Holloway. "Badge and weapon now." Holloway's hands were still trembling as he unclipped his badge from his uniform and handed it to Torres. He then unholstered his service weapon, cleared it, and relinquished that as well. The look on his face was a complex blend of shock, humiliation, and the dawning realization that his career was irrevocably over. Shaw addressed Torres. "I will be submitting a comprehensive report upon my return to headquarters. Please ensure that his body camera footage is preserved and logged as evidence." Torres nodded. "Yes, sir." Shaw returned to his Lamborghini, started the engine, and drove away, leaving Holloway standing on the roadside with no badge, no weapon, and no future in law enforcement. Chief Dominic Shaw entered the Parkdale Police Department headquarters 2 hours after leaving Officer Eric Holloway standing on the roadside, and his immediate action was to convene an emergency meeting with the command staff. Within 30 minutes, every sergeant, lieutenant, and captain in the building was assembled in the conference room, awaiting an explanation for the new chief's urgent summons. Shaw stood at the head of the table, a laptop connected to the projector before him, and he dispensed with pleasantries and introductions. He opened the laptop, accessed the body camera footage from Holloway's stop, and initiated playback. The room fell silent as the video depicted Holloway approaching the Lamborghini, demanding identification and proof of ownership without articulating a reason for the stop, disregarding Shaw's inquiries regarding the legal justification for the detention, and subsequently threatening arrest when Shaw refused to exit the vehicle. The audio clearly captured every spoken word, including Holloway's assertion of authority and Shaw's ultimatum of exiting the vehicle or facing arrest. The footage then transitioned to the search. Chief Dominic Shaw's voice resonated clearly from the recording, emphasizing multiple times that he had not granted permission for any search. Officer Eric Holloway, however, had disregarded Shaw's explicit refusal and proceeded to search the vehicle regardless. The critical moment captured was when Holloway opened the trunk, retrieved a briefcase, and discovered his own dismissal notice within it. As the video concluded, Shaw surveyed the faces of his command staff. A mixture of shock, discomfort, and a few expressions of prior expectation were evident. Shaw then addressed them, his tone calm, yet carrying an undeniable authority, signaling that this was not an open debate. He stated that Officer Eric Holloway had initiated a traffic stop that afternoon without any lawful grounds. Holloway had demanded proof of ownership for his vehicle, citing only the fact that Shaw, a black man, was driving an expensive car. Furthermore, Holloway had threatened arrest when Shaw asserted his constitutional right against unreasonable searches. The illegal search had been conducted despite Shaw's explicit refusal to consent. Shaw confirmed that all these events were meticulously documented on Holloway's body camera and on his personal recording. Captain Richard Brennan, a veteran of 23 years with the department, cleared his throat and inquired if Shaw had orchestrated the entire encounter. Brennan suggested Shaw had deliberately driven the car specifically to ascertain if an officer would stop him. Shaw turned to face Brennan directly, asserting that he had been operating a legally owned vehicle on a public thoroughfare, adhering to all traffic regulations. He argued that if this constituted a setup, then every resident in the city was inadvertently setting up officers by simply leaving their homes. Shaw explained that Holloway had a choice. He could have allowed Shaw to pass or followed him to observe any actual traffic violations. Instead, Holloway had pulled him over based on prejudice. When Shaw exercised his rights, Holloway had violated them. Shaw characterized this not as a setup, but as a crucial test of an officer's commitment to upholding the law, a test Holloway had failed. Shaw then displayed Holloway's personnel file on the screen, highlighting 2 previous complaints filed against him within the last 4 years. The first complaint, read aloud by Shaw, involved Dr. James Patterson, a 41-year-old black man driving a BMW. He had been stopped by Officer Holloway without cause, had proof of ownership demanded, and his vehicle searched without consent. Dr. Patterson had filed a formal complaint, which was investigated and resulted in a verbal warning to Holloway with no further disciplinary action. Shaw moved to the next highlighted entry, Complaint 2. This detailed an incident with Marcus Green, a 37-year-old black man driving a Mercedes. He was stopped by Officer Holloway without cause, falsely accused of drug trafficking, detained for 45 minutes, and his vehicle searched without consent, dicta. Green had also filed a complaint, which was investigated and resulted in another verbal warning, again with no further repercussions. Shaw reiterated that these 2 complaints mirrored the exact behavior he had experienced, yet both had been dismissed, and Holloway had continued his actions due to a lack of accountability within the department. He declared that this pattern of behavior would cease immediately. Lieutenant Jennifer Reyes then posed a question, asking if Holloway's termination was solely based on the recent stop or if the prior complaints were being used as justification. Shaw's response was swift and unambiguous. He was terminating Holloway for violating a citizen's constitutional rights that very day. He emphasized that the previous complaints demonstrated a pattern, not an isolated incident, a pattern the department had documented but overlooked. Shaw concluded by stating he was no longer ignoring it. He closed the laptop and addressed his command staff, reminding them he was hired to reform the department, a mandate from the mayor due to the community's eroded trust, a trust broken by officers like Holloway who operated without consequences. Shaw revealed that in his 3 days on the job, he had already been stopped 3 times. The first 2 officers had backed down upon his identification, but Holloway had escalated the situation and infringed upon his rights. Shaw asserted that Holloway would have treated any other black man in that car identically, the only difference being Shaw's authority to hold him accountable. Shaw paused, allowing his words to sink in, and announced a press conference for the following morning. He intended to present the body camera footage, explain the reasons for Holloway's termination, and unequivocally state that the department would no longer tolerate officers who engaged in racial profiling. He challenged anyone with an issue to submit their resignation immediately. The room remained silent. Shaw retrieved his laptop, declared the meeting adjourned, and instructed everyone to return to their duties. As the command staff departed, Shaw opened his email, finding a message from the police union representative requesting a meeting to discuss Holloway's termination and potential arbitration. Shaw typed a reply acknowledging arbitration as Holloway's right under the union contract, but asserting that the evidence was irrefutable and the termination would stand. He invited the representative to meet if they wished. He sent the email, closed the laptop, and leaned back, anticipating the city's awareness the following day of the clear message: racial profiling would not be tolerated in Parkdale. Chief Dominic Shaw held the press conference at 10 o'clock the next morning, drawing attendance from every local news outlet. Standing at the podium in his full uniform, with the Parkdale Police Department seal behind him, Shaw presented the facts without embellishment. He explained that he had been stopped by Officer Eric Holloway while driving his personal vehicle through District 7, obeying all traffic laws and committing no violations. Holloway, he stated, had stopped him without probable cause, demanded proof of ownership, threatened arrest when questioned, and searched his car despite explicit refusal of consent. He confirmed that all of this was captured on Holloway's body camera and that footage was being released to the public. As the footage played on the screen, the assembled reporters watched in silence as Holloway initiated the stop, demanded documents, ignored Shaw's questions, threatened arrest, and conducted the illegal search. Audible reactions from the journalists were heard when the video showed Holloway discovering his own termination letter in the briefcase. Shaw then announced that Officer Holloway had been terminated effective immediately, citing the violation of his Fourth Amendment rights, the use of racial profiling as justification for the stop, and a documented pattern of similar behavior over the preceding 4 years. He declared that the department's long-standing practice of ignoring such complaints was now over. The press conference garnered national attention within hours, with headlines accurately reporting the events. New police chief fires officer who racially profiled him. Cop finds own termination letter after illegal search of chief's car. And body cam shows officer threatening chief with arrest during unconstitutional stop. Officer Eric Holloway, through his union representative, filed for arbitration, alleging wrongful termination and arguing the stop was a legitimate exercise of his discretion. 6 weeks later, during the arbitration hearing, Holloway's attorney contended that Shaw had entrapped him by deliberately driving an expensive vehicle through a high-crime area to provoke a stop. The arbitrator, a retired judge with 30 years of experience, reviewed the body camera footage, Holloway's personnel file detailing prior complaints, and Shaw's testimony. 3 days later, the decision was unequivocally in favor of upholding the termination. The arbitrator's written decision detailed that Holloway had conducted the stop without reasonable suspicion, threatened arrest without legal justification, and searched the vehicle after explicit denial of consent. The decision also highlighted that Holloway's prior complaints evidenced a clear pattern of racially biased policing that the department had failed to address. Eric Holloway, a 33-year-old with 7 years in law enforcement, saw his career end. Applications to neighboring police departments were rejected after background checks revealed his termination for constitutional violations and racial profiling. He eventually found employment in private security, earning half his former salary, and his name became permanently linked to the case, serving as a cautionary example in police training programs nationwide. Chief Dominic Shaw instituted extensive reforms in the subsequent months. Every traffic stop now mandated officers document specific reasonable suspicion or probable cause in their reports. An independent oversight board conducted random and regular reviews of body camera footage. Officers exhibiting patterns of stops that disproportionately targeted minorities were flagged for retraining or dismissal. Within the first year, complaints of racial profiling decreased by 68%, and community trust in the department began a slow but steady rebuilding process. Shaw identified 8 additional officers with complaint patterns similar to Holloway's. 2 were terminated for refusing retraining, while 6 were placed on probation and required to complete constitutional policing courses. The message permeated the department. Racial profiling would not be tolerated, and officers unwilling to adhere to the Constitution would not retain their badges. 5 years later, the Parkdale Police Department is nationally recognized as a model for reform. Traffic stop data indicates a 73% decrease in racial disparities, and community surveys show a significant improvement in trust towards the police. Chief Dominic Shaw continues to lead the department, still driving his Lamborghini and holding officers accountable when they overstep their bounds. Eric Holloway remains in private security. His name is still the primary search result for examples of racial profiling leading to termination, and the body camera footage of him finding his own dismissal notice is still used in police academies as a stark warning of the consequences when bias overrides the law. The lesson learned was costly, public, and indelible. Driving an expensive car while black is not probable cause. Chiefs who test their officers are not setting traps, they are identifying long-ignored problems. Officers unable to treat individuals fairly, regardless of race, do not deserve to wear a badge. Dominic Shaw never regretted the test. He had identified an officer violating rights and removed him before further harm could occur. This was his duty, and he performed it without apology. If you believe that black individuals should be able to drive their own cars without facing racial profiling, even from their own law enforcement, please share this story. What reforms do you believe police departments require to eliminate racial bias in traffic stops? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this reinforced the idea that accountability must begin at the highest levels and that chiefs who overlook patterns enable abuse, subscribe. We are committed to ensuring every officer understands that the Constitution applies to everyone, including those in command.